Kash Patel orders. Arrest for Judge Dugan's scheme. AOC meltdown sparks courtroom chaos in the solemn halls of the Milwaukee Federal Courthouse. History was about to be made, not for the triumph of justice, but for the stunning collapse of it. Judge Hannah Dugan, once a respected figure in the Wisconsin legal community, now stood at the defendant's table, her black robes traded for a cold courtroom chair. Her crime was not a matter of debate. She had abused her authority, covertly aiding a known violent offender, Eduardo Flores Ruiz, an illegal immigrant with a history of brutality, to escape the lawful reach of immigration officers. Instead of upholding the law, she had twisted it to serve her personal ideals, allowing Flores Ruiz to vanish into the city's shadows once again. The atmosphere was electric with tension. The public had demanded answers. How had a figure sworn to uphold the law betrayed it so thoroughly? And more importantly, who would have the strength to hold her accountable? As the murmurs filled the courtroom, one man prepared to step into the storm, Kash Patel. His reputation for rooting out corruption preceded him, and this trial would become another battlefield in his war against the rot infecting America's institutions. But, unknown to many, a darker resistance was forming outside the courthouse walls. Ready to challenge Kash's pursuit of justice at every turn, the courthouse doors creaked open, and Kash Patel stepped inside. His face set with the kind of grim determination that only years of battle against the deep cracks in the American system could forge. His tailored Navy suit was a stark contrast to the chaos he knew he would soon face. Kash wasn't here to make friends, and certainly not to score political points. He was here to restore something far more sacred, the rule of law. It wasn't the first time he had gone up against corrupt officials, but this case carried a different weight. This was a federal judge, someone who had once sworn to uphold the Constitution, standing accused of aiding and abetting a violent criminal in open defiance of immigration authorities. Hannah Dugan wasn't merely bending the law, she had shattered it, and the country was watching. As Kash moved toward the prosecution table, he caught sight of the packed courtroom. Rows of journalists clutched their notepads, cameras flashed with fevered excitement, and murmurs filled the air like a low, constant hum. Every seat was taken. Protesters crowded the steps outside, chanting slogans against political persecution while waving signs condemning ICE and federal law enforcement. Somewhere in the background, he could hear their drums pounding, relentless and desperate. Waiting by his side was Pam Bondi, her calm demeanor betraying none of the fire she would unleash once the proceedings began. She greeted Kash with a small nod, an unspoken agreement passing between them. No matter what circus erupted around them, they would stay laser-focused on the facts. "Are you ready for this?" Pam asked quietly, slipping him a file folder heavy with evidence, witness statements, surveillance footage, court records, the arsenal they would use to dismantle Dugan's carefully crafted facade. Kash didn't hesitate. Born ready. Across the aisle, Judge Hannah Dugan sat stone-faced at the defense table, flanked by an army of high-priced attorneys. She looked smaller somehow without the black robe, a fallen empress forced to stand among the commoners. Her eyes flickered briefly toward Kash, and in that fleeting second, he saw it. Fear. But it wasn't just Dugan he had to worry about. In the gallery, a familiar face scowled at him from behind a line of reporters. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC herself, had flown in from Washington to make a spectacle of the trial. Her aides whispered frantically. Her phone was perpetually in hand, live tweeting outrage at the political weaponization of justice. Kash knew what AOC's presence meant. The battle wouldn't just be fought in the courtroom. It would rage in the media, in political backrooms, across every social feed in the country. Still, facts were stubborn things, and Kash had come armed. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Raymond Hartley, an unflappable senior federal judge brought in from another district, took his place at the bench. His weathered face showed no hint of sympathy as he surveyed the room. If Dugan had hoped for a friendly audience, she would find none here. Kash rose to deliver the opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice even but powerful, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "We are not here today because of politics. We are not here because of partisanship. We are here because the sanctity of the law itself has been betrayed." He paced slowly before the jury, locking eyes with each of them in turn, the defendant, Judge Hannah Dugan, used the authority granted to her by the American people not to uphold justice, but to pervert it. She knowingly and willfully obstructed federal officers in the execution of their duties. She aided a violent, repeat offender, an individual charged with battery, domestic abuse, and other violent crimes, in evading lawful arrest. Kash paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. You will hear testimony from eyewitnesses who watched Judge Dugan mislead federal agents. You will see security footage of her personally escorting the criminal through a restricted area meant only for court officers. And you will understand the devastating consequences of her betrayal, not just for the victims in this case, but for the rule of law itself. Across the room, AOC folded her arms defiantly, mouthing words to her aides. Kash ignored her. The courtroom was his battleground now. The defense rose next, spouting predictable rhetoric about humanitarian compassion and unjust immigration policies. They painted Dugan as a martyr, a heroine standing bravely against a broken system. Kash listened patiently. He had expected nothing less. They would try to bury the truth under an avalanche of emotion and half-truths. But truth, Kash knew, was indestructible if wielded properly. During a short recess, Pam Bondi leaned in, speaking low. Word is, AOC's organizing a press conference outside in an hour. She's pulling every string she can to pressure the jury through public opinion. Kash smirked. Let her. We'll win in here, where the facts still matter. Meanwhile, the first witnesses had arrived. Courtroom deputies, court clerks, even Dugan's own colleagues, each prepared to testify that what happened on that day was no accident, no misunderstanding, but a deliberate, calculated abuse of power behind closed doors. Kash had reviewed it all in painstaking detail. How Dugan had misled ICE officers, directing them to a different part of the courthouse. How she had motioned for Flores Ruiz and his attorney to sneak through a restricted jury exit, never meant for civilian use. How she had screamed at federal agents, obstructing their lawful pursuit. The evidence was overwhelming. But Kash knew the real battle would be not just proving Dugan's guilt, but withstanding the firestorm of political backlash that was brewing like a hurricane outside these walls. He took a deep breath and glanced at the American flag hanging behind the judge's bench. This wasn't just about one rogue judge. It was about reminding the country that no one, no matter how powerful, no matter how connected, stood above the law. As the gavel struck and the court was called back into session, Kash Patel adjusted his tie, squared his shoulders, and prepared for the war ahead. It wasn't going to be easy, but real battles never are. Pam Bondi didn't waste a second. As soon as the courtroom doors swung open for recess, she was already in motion, her phone buzzing against her palm, her team on standby. Every move Kash made inside the courtroom needed to be reinforced by a tactical assault outside it, and Pam was a master strategist. She had spent years navigating the stormy seas of high-profile prosecutions, outwitting media-driven defenses, and slicing through political theater like a surgeon. Today would be no different. While Kash focused on crushing Judge Hannah Dugan with irrefutable evidence, Pam's battlefield was the public mind, the voters, the spectators, the everyday Americans watching, confused and angry about what was happening in Milwaukee. Her first objective was clear: control the narrative before AOC could twist it. Already, the young congresswoman had been staging her media blitz outside the courthouse, flanked by sympathetic activists and reporters eager for a soundbite. AOC's message was simple but dangerous. The trial wasn't about justice, it was about persecution. It was about silencing heroes who dared to defy an unjust system. Pam saw right through it. Emotions over facts, outrage over truth. It was a playbook she had dismantled 100 times before, and she would dismantle it again, pulling her blazer tighter against the brisk Wisconsin wind. Pam stepped onto the courthouse steps, flanked by a few trusted aides. Microphones immediately thrust toward her. Camera lights flared to life. Pam! Pam! Is it true Judge Dugan is being targeted because of her political beliefs? One reporter shouted. Bondi gave a small, practiced smile, the kind that signaled she was about to carve through the noise with brutal precision. Let's be very clear, she began, her voice cutting clean and sharp. This is not about politics. It's not about immigration policy. It's about a sitting judge who used her position to obstruct justice and aid a violent offender. No amount of slogans or hashtags will change those facts. She lifted a document for the cameras too. See the unredacted arrest warrant, signed and sealed, describing Dugan's actions in painstaking legal detail. The evidence is overwhelming, Pam continued. Judge Dugan misdirected federal agents, personally escorted a dangerous criminal through a private courthouse exit, and undermined an ongoing state prosecution while the victims sat waiting in that courtroom. If you believe in the rule of law, you should be outraged. Full stop. The reporters fired more questions. But Pam moved deliberately, sticking to the high ground. No political insults, no personal attacks, only the ruthless repetition of truth. Inside the courthouse, Kash caught the tail end of Pam's press conference on muted TV screen. He smirked, feeling the energy shift. They weren't just fighting back, they were taking ground. Still, AOC wasn't backing down. Minutes later, another flurry of headlines appeared. AOC demands DOJ investigate federal prosecutors. Ocasio-Cortez claims judicial independence under attack. Her team had started circulating talking points that painted Kash and Pam as political hitmen, abusing their authority to terrorize public servants. Pam anticipated it perfectly. Back in their temporary war room, a repurposed conference room on the third floor, she huddled with Kash and the rest of the legal team. We're not going to dignify her garbage with a direct rebuttal, she said, pointing at the latest social media posts, lighting up Twitter and Instagram. If they want a circus, let them have it. We stay above it, we hammer the facts, nothing else. Kash agreed, tapping a stack of documents on the table. The deputy testimonies are solid. We've got 3 independent confirmations that Dugan deliberately misled ICE. The surveillance footage shows her physically ushering Flores Ruiz through the jury door. No jury in the world is going to miss the pattern. Pam nodded, but her mind was already 10 moves ahead. They're going to attack the witnesses next, she warned. Smear the courtroom deputies as racist, anti-immigrant, maybe even accuse them of lying to protect their own jobs. We need to prepare character defenses for every one of them. Kash smiled slightly. You're relentless, she shrugged. You have to be when you're fighting liars with a PR machine. The team worked into the evening, building a wall of airtight facts that not even the most passionate political grandstanding could breach. They cross-referenced witness accounts, prepped quick response statements for inevitable media gotcha moments, and timed their next public disclosures to coincide with key trial developments. Pam even coordinated quiet background briefings for a handful of respected journalists, the kind who still cared about facts to make sure the real story reached the people who mattered. By the next morning, the battlefield had shifted again. The courtroom filled once more, and this time, the public's mood had changed subtly. A few heads turned away from AOC's cameras. A few skeptical faces replaced the earlier anger. Seeds of doubt about Dugan's innocence had been planted, and they were starting to grow. Inside the courtroom, Kash opened the next phase of the trial with devastating precision. The first witness, a veteran courtroom deputy, took the stand. On the day in question, the deputy testified. Judge Dugan directed federal officers to the chief judge's office, away from the courtroom. She then called the defendant and his lawyer to follow her to the jury door, a restricted area, and physically led them out the side of the building. Kash pressed the point. Had you ever seen a judge use the jury door for non-custodial defendants before? Never, the deputy answered firmly. It's strictly off-limits. Pam watched the jury carefully. Their eyes were locked on the witness, their notepads filling with furious scribbles. Some even looked genuinely shocked. Across the aisle, Dugan sat frozen, her once defiant posture sagging. Even her high-powered attorneys looked rattled. Pam allowed herself a small, satisfied breath. The strategy was working, but she knew better than anyone a wounded enemy could be more dangerous than a healthy one, and AOC was already planning her next move. There would be no easy victories here. This was a siege, and Pam Bondi intended to see it through to the bitter end. The courthouse felt like a pressure cooker by the afternoon. The evidence Kash Patel had presented was irrefutable, and the weight of it pressed down on the courtroom like a dense, suffocating fog. Witness after witness took the stand, confirming the same damning pattern. Judge Hannah Dugan had not only undermined the legal process, but had done so deliberately, with full knowledge of what was at stake. The walls were closing in on Dugan, and she knew it. But just as Kash and Pam Bondi could sense the momentum swinging in their favor, another force barreled into the proceedings. like a wrecking ball. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. If Dugan's lawyers couldn't win inside the courtroom, AOC was determined to dismantle it from the outside. It began subtly at first. As the court reconvened after a short recess, Kash noticed a subtle ripple moving through the gallery. More cameras, more unfamiliar faces. Activists squeezed into the back rows with hastily printed shirts reading "Defend Democracy" and "Hands off our judges" in neon letters. AOC herself wasn't in the room yet, but her fingerprints were everywhere. Outside, a full-blown protest had materialized. Hundreds gathered, chanting slogans against ICE, against Kash, against the very idea of prosecuting a judge. Pam Bondi's aides reported that AOC's team had chartered buses to bring in protesters from neighboring states. Flyers were handed out on every downtown corner, each framing Dugan as a martyr and Kash as a fascist. Kash remained steady, even as the noise outside the courthouse grew louder, seeping through the thick walls like an encroaching storm. But it wasn't just noise. AOC's real assault came next inside the very chambers of power. Just as the next witness, a courthouse security officer, was about to take the stand, the door to the courtroom burst open. In marched two men in suits carrying official documents, a formal motion filed by AOC's legal team, demanding the trial be halted immediately under claims of egregious violations of judicial independence and abuse of prosecutorial power. The courtroom gasped. Judge Hartley, presiding over the case, looked furious as he reviewed the papers. This wasn't just a PR stunt. It was a coordinated, strategic move, an attempt to jam the legal machinery itself, to grind the trial to a halt through procedural chaos. Kash leaned forward, speaking low to Pam. They're trying to turn this into a circus. Pam's expression didn't change. Let them try. We're ready. Judge Hartley took a long moment before responding. Motion denied, he said flatly, slamming his gavel. This court will not be intimidated by political theatrics. Proceed. A wave of relief swept through Kash's team, but the damage was already rippling outward. News alerts exploded across the internet. AOC intervenes in Wisconsin trial. Democrat leaders condemn authoritarian prosecution. New questions raised about legitimacy of trial. Pam immediately began damage control, shooting off text to her media team to double down on facts, to push out new statements, reinforcing the mountain of evidence stacked against Dugan. Meanwhile, outside, AOC was just getting started. By late afternoon, she held an impromptu rally on the courthouse steps, standing atop a hastily assembled platform, flanked by progressive politicians and shouting into a megaphone. "This is not justice," AOC cried, her voice crackling through the cheap speakers. "This is political revenge. Judge Dugan is guilty of nothing except compassion and humanity. This administration wants to turn us into a police state, and Kash Patel is their pawn." The crowd roared with approval, banners waving in the cold wind. Kash watched footage of the rally from a courthouse monitor, jaw tight. He could already imagine the jurors' families being bombarded with news segments that painted him as a villain and Dugan as a saint. The danger wasn't in the courtroom, it was in the pressure mounting outside it. Pam joined him, arms crossed. "They're trying to get to the jury," she said quietly. "I know," Kash said grimly. "We can't let them." Inside the courtroom, Judge Hartley took measures to protect the integrity of the trial, sequestering the jury, limiting their access to media, issuing gag orders on witnesses. It was a desperate firewall, but necessary. Still, Kash knew the psychological damage couldn't be entirely undone. Some jurors would wonder if they were being used. Some might second-guess what they saw with their own eyes. That was the goal of AOC's disruption: sow doubt, create confusion, muddy the water. And if they couldn't win outright, they'd make sure no one else could either. The trial resumed the next morning, but everything had changed. Protesters now ringed the courthouse day and night, their chants echoing through the marble halls like a drumbeat of defiance. Reporters harassed witnesses as they arrived, hoping to catch a stray comment that could spin into scandal. Online death threats poured in against Kash, against Pam, even against some members of the jury whose names had somehow leaked to activist groups. Security was doubled. Metal detectors were added at every entrance. Plainclothes officers roamed the hallways. The courthouse had become a fortress under siege. But inside that siege, Kash Patel stood unmoved. He knew the truth. He had the evidence. And he had one weapon no amount of shouting could overcome: the law itself. In a closed-door meeting with Judge Hartley and the defense, Kash made it clear they would not be bullied into retreat. "This trial isn't about politics," Kash said firmly. "It's about whether a judge of the United States abused her power to shelter a violent criminal. That's a question no mob can answer. Only the jury can." Hartley nodded gravely. He had seen the same thing happening across the country: the slow corrosion of law by anger, by emotion, by fear. The court would go on. The fight would go on. But so would AOC outside the courthouse. She announced the formation of a new Judicial Protection Caucus, pledging to introduce emergency legislation to block future prosecutions of vulnerable public officials like Dugan. It was a nakedly partisan move, but it didn't matter. The headlines wrote themselves. Kash understood then that winning this trial wouldn't be enough. This was a much bigger war. And the survival of American justice itself might just hang in the balance. The gavel struck once again, calling the restless courtroom to order. Despite the noise outside, despite the desperate political grandstanding, the law had not yet fallen, and Kash Patel intended to make sure it wouldn't. Today was the day the evidence would speak louder than any protest. Kash stood at the center of it all, calm and razor-sharp, as the prosecution's key witnesses took the stand one by one. They weren't politicians. They weren't activists. They were ordinary public servants, the eyes and ears inside the courthouse, the day Judge Hannah Dugan made her fatal decision. First came Deputy Marshal Raines, a 20-year veteran with no political loyalties, no public profile. His voice was steady as he recounted how Dugan had intentionally misled him and his team. "She pointed us toward the Chief Judge's chambers. He testified, said she'd help arrange things. We believed her." Meanwhile, the suspect was being led out another way. Kash guided the testimony with surgical precision. "And was there any standard procedure violated when she redirected your team?" Raines nodded grimly. "Absolutely. We were instructed not to separate from the target without a federal agent present. She knowingly created that separation." The jury scribbled furiously on their pads, their faces tight with concentration. Even the defense team shifted uncomfortably. Next came a courthouse clerk, hesitant at first, but emboldened under Kash's careful questioning. "I heard her tell the defense attorney to follow her through the jury door," the clerk said. "No one uses that exit except jurors or escorted inmates. Never defendants out on bond. Never." The surveillance footage sealed it. On the courtroom's large monitor, the jurors watched grainy black and white footage of Judge Dugan beckoning Flores Ruiz and his attorney. They saw her glancing nervously over her shoulder before ushering them through a secured door marked authorized personnel only. No sound, no commentary, just actions. Betrayal captured taut in real time. Pam Bondi sat quietly in the front row, her arms crossed, her sharp gaze studying the jurors' faces. She could see it happening, the slow, inevitable erosion of whatever sympathy they might have had for Dugan. The facts were a current, sweeping them toward an unavoidable conclusion. Kash let the video roll twice. Silence filled the room each time. Only after the second viewing did he turn back to the jury. "You have seen it with your own eyes," he said simply. No one forced Judge Dugan's hand. No misunderstanding. No momentary confusion. This was a willful act to undermine federal law enforcement and to shield a violent criminal from justice. In the gallery, the activists fidgeted. Some whispered furiously into their phones. They had come for a political spectacle. They were witnessing the slow, grinding machinery of truth. The defense scrambled to recover. They trotted out experts, talking heads, even sympathetic former colleagues who praised Dugan's character and dedication to social progress. They tried to drown the courtroom in language about compassion, trauma, and systemic injustice. But the footage never lied. The testimony never wavered. And Kash, relentless as ever, refused to let the jury forget. In closing that day, he summarized it cleanly. "We are not here to debate immigration policy. We are not here to argue political ideologies. We are here because an officer of the court decided her personal beliefs were above her oath. She decided that her ideology was more important than the law. And that, ladies and gentlemen, cannot stand." As he finished, Kash caught a glimpse of Dugan at the defense table, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her water glass. For the first time, her mask of arrogance had cracked. outside. AOC's rallies grew louder, wilder, more desperate. Inside, though, the truth had taken root. The next phase would be decisive. And Kash Patel was ready. The final morning of the trial broke under a heavy sky, gray clouds looming over the Milwaukee courthouse like an omen. Inside, the air was thicker than ever. Every creak of the floorboards, every cough, every breath amplified into something almost unbearable. Today, it would all end. Kash Patel adjusted his tie, not out of nerves, but out of ritual. Calm, focused, relentless. That had been his posture from the start, and it would be his posture now. Across the courtroom, Pam Bondi nodded once at him from her seat, her expression unreadable but solid. They had done everything they could. Now, it was out of their hands. The jury filed in, each of them looking different from when the trial began, more burdened, more awake to the weight of their duty. Judge Hartley, towering and severe behind the bench, instructed them on the gravity of their decision, his voice cutting clean through the tense courtroom. Has the jury reached a verdict? He asked. The foreman, a middle-aged woman in a navy blazer, stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held the slip of paper. We have, Your Honor. Kash barely breathed as the clerk read the decision aloud. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of harboring a fugitive, guilty. A visible shudder passed through the courtroom. In the gallery, a low moan escaped from a small cluster of Dugan's supporters. AOC, seated behind them, stiffened, her fists clenching at her sides. Even she hadn't been able to spin the undeniable into innocence. Kash allowed himself a single breath of victory, not celebration, not vengeance, just relief. Justice, after so many obstacles, had prevailed. Judge Hartley immediately ordered Dugan into custody pending sentencing. There would be no special treatment, no second chances. The betrayal of her office was too severe. 2 U.S. Marshals approached the defense table. Hannah Dugan's face crumpled in disbelief as the cold steel of handcuffs closed around her wrists. The cameras flashed. Outside, the protesters' chants faltered, some confused, some enraged, some eerily silent. She was led away through the same door she had once used to smuggle a violent criminal to freedom. Pam Bondi leaned over and whispered to Kash, "That's what real accountability looks like." Kash didn't smile. He only nodded. He knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. Outside the courthouse, AOC rushed to the microphones. Her voice strained but defiant. "This is a dark day for America," she declared, "when judges are punished for showing compassion." But the crowd was smaller now. The energy fractured. Some reporters pressed her with harder questions than before. What about the victims Judge Dugan betrayed? What about the oath she swore to uphold? Pam Bondi's earlier groundwork had worked. The public, tired of emotional manipulation, was starting to look at the facts again. Kash exited the courthouse without fanfare, his steps steady. Reporters surrounded him, shouting questions, cameras flashing. He paused, turned, and said only one thing: no one is above the law. Not gang members, not politicians, not even judges. He walked away, leaving the chaos behind him. Later, in a small side room upstairs, Kash and Pam sat alone, watching the courthouse steps empty out for a rare moment. There was peace between them, a silence thick with meaning. Pam finally broke it. "You think they'll learn anything from this?" Kash gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe not. But we didn't do it for them. We did it because it was right." Pam lifted a water bottle and a mock toast. "To the rule of law," she said. Kash clinked his bottle against hers. "To the fight," he answered. Because deep down, they both knew justice wasn't a destination. It was a battlefield. And Kash Patel was ready to keep fighting.